What happens when the lights go dim, the hospital hallways empty, and the night shift begins? Nurses have seen it all: life, death, and sometimes things that should not exist. Hospitals hold more than just the living. They carry whispers of the past, echoes of pain, and entities that refuse to leave. These are 6 terrifying true horror stories told by nurses who witness things they can never explain. If you think you can handle it, read on, but don't be surprised if you start hearing whispers in the dark by the end. Story 1. The Screaming Room. I used to work the night shift at a now abandoned psychiatric hospital. It was an old facility, built in the 1920s, and it had seen its fair share of horrors. The place had a reputation. Patients talked about hearing whispers, doors slamming on their own, and seeing shadows where no one should be. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the West Wing. There was a room, room 502, that was always locked. Always. No patients were housed there, and no one spoke about it. But every night, around 2:30 a.m., we would hear screaming coming from that room. Blood-curdling, agonizing screams. It would go on for minutes, and then silence. Security would check, but the room was always empty. One night I had enough. I asked an old nurse about it, and she paled. "They locked someone in there a long time ago," she whispered. "A patient who never stopped screaming, even after she died." That night, I stood outside room 502 at 2:30 a.m. The screaming started, echoing through the hall. My body froze, but I forced myself to look through the small window in the door, and I saw her. A woman with hollow eyes, her mouth twisted open in an endless scream. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with me. The next thing I remember, I was on the floor, a nurse shaking me awake. The door was still locked, and the room was empty. But the screaming never stopped. Story 2, The Shadow in the Basement. Every mental hospital has a basement, a place where old records are kept, where outdated equipment gathers dust. At my hospital, the basement was strictly off limits. The locks were rusted, the lights barely worked, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and something else. Something rotten. One night I was sent down there to retrieve a file. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A presence. The hairs on my arms stood up. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw something move in the darkness. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. My flashlight flickered again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it. It stood at the far end of the room, watching. Then it moved. The next thing I remember, I was outside the basement door, gasping for breath. No one could explain how I got out, but I'll never forget the feeling of something breathing down my neck, whispering as I fled. Story 3, The Patient Who Wasn't There. One of the eeriest experiences I ever had working in a mental hospital involved a patient who wasn't there. We had received a new admission, an elderly woman who had been found wandering the streets, confused and muttering about them. She had no family, no records, no identification. When the paramedics brought her in, she resisted, clutching at the air as though trying to hold on to something unseen. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room as if tracking invisible figures. Her whispers were frantic. "They're coming! They're always watching! You have to stop them!" We placed her in a secure room, gave her a meal, and let her rest. The usual intake process applied. Medical checkup, psychological evaluation scheduled for the morning. She had been exhausted, her frail body shaking with fatigue, so we assumed she would sleep through the night. But the next morning she was gone. The room was locked from the inside. The bed was still made, untouched. No signs of forced entry or escape. The security cameras showed nothing. No one entering, no one leaving. The only footage of the night was a strange flickering of static around the time she would have disappeared. The nurses were shaken but rationalized it. A clerical error, perhaps? Maybe she had never really been there at all. But we had her name logged in, her presence confirmed by multiple staff members. We couldn't just forget about her. That night, the whispers started. The nurses on duty reported hearing her voice in the corridors, soft and urgent. "They're coming. They're watching." Some swore they saw movement in their peripheral vision, a fleeting shadow, a shifting darkness in the corners of the rooms. One orderly, while checking the empty intake room, felt a freezing hand brush against his arm. Over the following nights, the whispers grew more insistent, weaving through the hospital like a chilling wind. Patients became restless, some crying out in their sleep, others pointing to unseen figures lurking just beyond the light. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with something we couldn't explain. Then one night we found her, or at least her body, buried deep in the hospital's old records. In a wing that hadn't been opened in decades, we discovered a forgotten storage room. Dust-coated files, rusting metal cabinets, and decaying paperwork filled the space. But what caught our attention was the skeletal remains slumped in a decayed chair, wrapped in the tattered remains of a hospital gown. A brittle patient wristband clung to one bone-thin wrist, the name barely legible under layers of dust. It was her, the same woman, the same face from the admission forms. She had been a patient in the 1960s, declared missing, presumed escaped, but she had never left. As we stared at her remains, the air around us turned ice cold, and then, just as suddenly, the whisper returned, right behind us, barely more than a breath against the ear. "They're here." The lights flickered, the door slammed shut, and the screaming began.
Story 4. The hands under the bed. Some patients see things that aren't there.
Others see things that we wish weren't there. One patient, a young girl, was admitted after she stopped speaking altogether. Her parents claimed she refused to sleep in her bed, saying, "The hands will get me." We assumed it was childhood trauma. That was until one of the nurses saw them too. She was checking on the girl late one night when the child sat up suddenly, staring at the floor. "They're coming," she whispered. The nurse bent down to assure her everything was fine. That's when she saw the fingers, long, bony fingers curling out from underneath the bed, gripping the mattress. She screamed and yanked the girl away. Other staff ran in, turning on all the lights. There was nothing there. But the child never slept in a bed again. Over time, more staff members reported strange occurrences in the girl's room. Whispering sounds in the darkness, the rustle of unseen movement, and a faint scratching noise coming from beneath the bed frame. The girl remained silent, her eyes hollow with fear, refusing to so much as glance in the direction of the bed. One night, a new nurse, skeptical of the rumors, decided to sleep in the room to prove nothing was amiss. She lay down, flashlight in hand, determined to put an end to the hysteria. Hours passed in silence. Just as she was about to drift off, she felt it, the faintest brush against her ankle. Bolting upright, she swung the flashlight under the bed. The beam of light revealed deep claw marks scratched into the wooden floor. But there was nothing else. No movement, no sound. Still, she refused to sleep in the room again. Eventually, the girl was transferred to another facility. The room was left vacant, but no other patient would stay there for long. Complaints of nightmares, whispers, and the feeling of something unseen lurking just beneath the bed forced the administration to permanently seal it off. But on some nights, when the halls are quiet and the lights are dim, staff swear they still hear it. The soft sound of fingers dragging across the floor. Story 5. The elevator that goes nowhere. There was an old elevator in our hospital that no one used. It was slow, outdated, and barely functional. But every so often we would hear it moving at night. The doors would open, but no one was inside. One night I was working late when the elevator dinged. The doors slid open and a cold gust of air rushed out. I stepped closer, peering inside. A handprint appeared on the metal wall. Then another. Then another. I ran. Security checked, but the camera footage showed the elevator never moved. Over the following weeks, more strange reports surfaced. Janitors swore they heard the whir of gears and the rattle of the old chains when no one was around. Nurses passing by at night caught glimpses of shadows shifting behind the closed doors, only for the elevator to remain empty upon inspection. One particularly brave orderly decided to step inside, determined to prove it was all in our heads. He pressed a button. The elevator jolted, groaned, then descended. It never reached the next floor. After several minutes of silence, the radio crackled, his voice barely audible, whispering frantically, "I'm not alone." When security pried open the doors, the elevator was empty. The orderly was gone. The only thing they found was a single fresh handprint smeared across the metal wall. The elevator was officially decommissioned after that. But late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the halls are still, we sometimes hear the distant sound of the old gears turning. And we know it's moving again. Story 6. The room that shouldn't exist. Hospitals are strange places. They hold life and death in their sterile walls, and in the quietest moments, you can almost hear the echoes of both. I had worked as a nurse in St. Augustine Memorial for 6 years before I noticed the sealed-off wing. It was an old part of the hospital, long abandoned. The hallways were blocked with caution tape and boarded-up doors. No one ever spoke about it, and even the oldest staff members shrugged when asked. "It's just closed off," they would say. "Been that way for years."
but patients sometimes whispered about it.
"Who's in that room?" they would ask, eyes darting towards the darkened hallway. "The one with the light on." I always dismissed it as post-operative confusion or medication-induced hallucinations, but then one night I saw it for myself. I was on the night shift, walking past the abandoned corridor on my way to check on a patient. Out of habit, I glanced down the hallway, and there it was, a soft, eerie glow seeping from under the door of a room that shouldn't have had any electricity. I froze. The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a reflection, maybe a maintenance worker had gone inside. But my gut told me otherwise. Slowly I stepped closer, my heart pounding against my ribs. The closer I got, the more I felt it. A heavy presence in the air, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I reached the door and hesitated. Then, against all better judgment, I pressed my ear to it, and I heard breathing. Slow, deep, ragged. Something was inside. A cold chill ran down my spine. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, it moved on its own. The knob twisted. The door cracked open, and in the darkness beyond, two eyes stared back at me. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. But the next thing I knew, I was on the floor of the main hallway, my co-workers shaking me awake. "You passed out," one of them said, concern etched on her face. I sat up, dazed. "The room! The door!" I pointed towards the corridor, my voice barely a whisper. They followed my gaze. The door was sealed. The light was gone. The hallway was just as abandoned as it had always been. But from that night on, I saw the light every night. No matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew it was waiting. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memory of those eyes haunted me. I barely slept. I started avoiding that part of the hospital, even taking longer routes just to stay away from it. Then the whispers started. Not from patients this time, but from the staff. "I swear I heard something in that wing last night." My pager went off near there, but when I checked, there was no call. I saw the light again. It wasn't just me. One night, I decided I had to know the truth. I dug through the hospital archives, looking for any record of that wing. It took hours of searching, but finally I found something. An old newspaper clipping from 1956. "Doctor vanishes in mysterious hospital incident." My breath caught in my throat as I read. Dr. Alan Grayson had been a well-respected surgeon at St. Augustine Memorial. One night he had gone into room 733, the same room I had seen the light in, and had never come out. The staff had searched everywhere, but there was no sign of him. The only clue left behind was his stethoscope, lying neatly on the floor beside the empty bed. Shortly after his disappearance, the hospital had sealed off the wing. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. That had to be it. That was why the room was still there. Why the light still turned on. Why I had seen those eyes. Dr. Grayson had never left. I knew I should let it go, but I couldn't. The more I learned, the more I needed to know. So I did something reckless, something dangerous. I went back. It was past midnight when I made my way down the deserted hallway. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. The light was on. A soft, pulsing glow seeped from beneath the door of room 733. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. It was ice cold. Slowly I pushed the door open. The room was empty, at least at first glance. The bed was still there, covered in dust and tattered sheets. The walls were lined with old medical charts, their ink faded with time. But the air was heavy, oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on me. Then I heard it. That same breathing, slow, deep, ragged. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall, wearing what looked like an old doctor's coat. Its face was gaunt, hollow, but the eyes were the same ones I had seen that night. Dr. Grayson. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. He lifted a hand, pointing toward the bed. I followed his gesture and saw something glinting in the dust. A stethoscope. I swallowed hard, reaching down to pick it up. The moment my fingers touched it, a whisper filled the room. "Help me!" The voice was weak, desperate. And then the room was gone. I was in a different time, a different place. The walls were pristine, the bed neatly made. Dr. Grayson stood before me, alive, his face filled with terror. The door slammed shut behind him. He turned, pounding on it, screaming for help. But no one came. And then, the light in the room flickered, and something else appeared. A darkness creeping from the corners. It swallowed the room, consuming everything. Dr. Grayson turned to me, his eyes wide with fear as the darkness took him.
And then I was back.
The room was old and dusty again. The stethoscope was still in my hand, and the figure of Dr. Grayson was gone. But the whisper lingered. "Help me!" I ran out of that room and never looked back. The next day, I told the hospital director everything. He listened in silence, then nodded solemnly.
"You're not the first," he said.
They never reopened the wing.
But they did one thing. They put a plaque outside room 703 in memory of Dr. Alan Grayson.
Gone but never forgotten.
The light still appears sometimes. Patients still ask about it. But now when I pass by, I don't feel fear. I feel sorrow.
Because I know he's still there,
Waiting.
Hospitals hold more than just the sick and injured. They hold memories, pain, spirits that refuse to leave. If you ever find yourself in a hospital at night and hear whispers, footsteps, or breathing when no one is there, leave. Because some things can't be cured, and some patients never check out.